We're going to go ahead and start with requests for bill introductions. If you have a bill introduction, anyone? Hello, Representative. Okay, no bill introductions. Moving on. So today's conversation is going to be about student achievement and proficiency and understanding what student achievement is measured by and what proficiency measurements are. So we're going to begin with Nick Myers, our revisor, to give us a presentation on state assessment proficiency statutes and any Supreme Court comments relating to such. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And members of the committee, you should have two memos in front of you, and I'm going to start on the first one that's called the subject line Overview of Statutes Relating to Statewide Assessments, and then statutes that are relating to reviews and reporting of state assessment results. So the primary statute here that you're looking at when we're talking about statewide assessments, what the legislature has required the State Board of Education to do is KSA 725170. This statute, I'm summarizing here, requires the State Board of Education to design and adopt a school district accreditation system that's based upon improvement in performance and that is geared toward achieving the Rose capacities. Establish curriculum standards that reflect high academic standards, and then review those curriculum standards every 7 years. And then lastly, provide for statewide assessments in the core academic areas of math, science, reading, writing, and social studies. The State Board is also to determine the performance levels for those statewide assessment scores, and then also ensure that those assessments are compatible with the curriculum standards. One other statute that I found that relates to the state assessments and what's required of state assessments is in KSA 723236, and this requires that questions relating to personal financial literacy must be included in these statewide assessments for math and social studies, and the State Board is to use results from those questions on those tests to determine whether personal financial literacy programs in school districts are equipping students with the skills needed in that subject matter. Next, I'm going to cover the statutes, the primary statutes that I found regarding where the State Board or the Department of Education or school districts are required to review or report on state assessment results. So let's begin with 721163. This statute requires each school district board of education to conduct a needs assessment and then also to conduct a review of the annual state assessment results for that school district. As part of this review, the statute requires that the Board of Education is required to document the barriers that must be overcome for students to achieve proficiency above level 2 on the state assessments. Any budget actions that should be taken to meet that proficiency standard, and then also the estimated amount of time that it will take for all students to achieve that proficiency score if they implement those budget actions. KSA 723262 establishes the Every Child Can Read Act, and within this act, state boards of education are required to measure and evaluate student literacy, especially for those students in grades K through 3. And state boards of education are required to use those state assessment results and then other assessment tools to evaluate that literacy achievement. KSA 725153 requires each school district to track and report the longitudinal performance of students who are continuously receiving at-risk programs and services within the school district. And this longitudinal reporting is to include reviews and assessments of the reviews and looking at the state assessment results as well as other assessments and measures of at-risk achievement. KSA 725178, and I believe these are some of the reports we'll be hearing from the department today. This statute requires the Department of Education to provide performance accountability reports and longitudinal achievement reports on the State Department of Education's website. And these reports are to show the achievement levels of all students, each school district, each attendance center of a school, and then also for each accredited non-public school. So the performance accountability reports are required to be published on the KSDU website, as I said, and updated annually. This is supposed to be done in a single-page format with all the categories of achievement that are established by the State Board of Education and identified under the state's plan that was submitted pursuant to the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Also, the longitudinal achievement reports are required to provide the achievement rates on the state assessments. Again, for those schools, particular attendance centers, school districts, students and subgroups, and the year-over-year change in achievement rates, starting with the school year in which the state board implemented its new achievement standards on the state assessments. So then, additionally, this statute requires a summary report from the department, and then a student-focused longitudinal achievement report. And on the last page of that memo, you can see what's required of the summary report and the longitudinal achievement report. So the summary report is essentially a summary of the achievement results from English language arts and math state assessments over the preceding 5 years for all students and student subgroups, a comparison of those assessment scores to any other evaluation metrics that are used by the State Board of Education, such as college and career ready, graduation rates, et cetera. A comparison to other educational assessments, such as the NAEP, an analysis of the trends in student achievement, and a review of the conditions that are impacting the outcomes, a review of the academic interventions that schools are using, and recommended recommendations regarding additional interventions that should be used. And then also a summary of the performance levels of the state assessments and the scales and cut scores, generally a description of what those mean when students and parents receive those state assessment results. In addition, this student-focused longitudinal achievement report is to begin, or has begun, with the students that have entered, or did enter 3rd and 8th grade in school year 22-23. And this report then is to summarize the longitudinal achievement of that student cohort over a 3-year period, of each one of those student cohorts over a 3-year period. This longitudinal achievement report is then to be repeated every 3 years for those same grade levels and follow those students for 3 years again. So this longitudinal achievement report will include a summary of the improvement or learning loss that's occurring with those groups of students, an analysis of the evaluation and metrics that are used to measure the year-over-year achievement of those students, a review again of the academic interventions that are being used, and then the achievement results from the statewide assessments and then other assessment data used by the school district. Madam Chair, that's a review of the statutes relating to state assessments and reviews and reports, and I'd be happy to answer questions on that before moving into overview of Gannon.
Go ahead and proceed.
Okay.
Madam Chair, if I may, I think Representative Estes is waiting on WebEx to be let in. If we could let her in,
All right.
please. Sorry to interrupt. My apologies.
Thank you.
Okay, Madam Chair and committee. So my next memo is something I've briefed to this committee before and to the interim committee. This is not a full overview of every Gannon decision. That could be very lengthy. This is a summary of what Gannon requires, and then particularly looking at the Gannon 4 decision, where the court applied the adequacy test that it put forth in Gannon 1 to the Class Act, and what the court looked at with regard to the inputs and outputs of the Class Act's school finance system. So as you all are aware, Article 6, Section 6 of the Kansas Constitution requires the legislature to make suitable provision for finance of the public education system in the state. So again, in Gannon 1, the Kansas Supreme Court held that this constitutional provision requires both an adequate and an equitable school finance system. And the court then established separate tests to evaluate both adequacy and equity. So to comply with the equity requirement, you've all heard this, equity requires in the court's eyes that school districts and the school finance system must provide school districts with reasonably equal access to substantially similar educational opportunity through similar tax effort. This is generally a wealth-based disparities test that looks at the wealth-based disparities among school districts, and with equity decisions from the court, equity implications often arose from the state aid equalization formulas, and then also school finance provisions that disproportionately either benefited or harmed a district's ability to access state or local funds. With regard to adequacy, the court put forth an adequacy test in Gannon 1 that states that the legislature must ensure that the public education financing system, through both its structure and its implementation, has to be reasonably calculated to have all Kansas public education students meet or exceed the Rose capacities. And you have these capacities codified in KSA 723218, and the court looked to that statute and the legislature's adoption of those capacities when it put forth this adequacy test. So moving on to past Gannon's 2 and 3, which were relating to equity decisions, we got to Gannon 4, and in Gannon 4, the Kansas Supreme Court applied its adequacy test for the first time to evaluate whether the public education financing system was reasonably calculated to have all students meet or exceed the Rose capacities. So the court looked at evidence regarding the structure of the formula and the implementation of the formula, and I will note that this decision was based on the Class Act. Otherwise, you may know it as the block grants formula. So this is what the court was looking at in Gannon 4. So under this, as I said, they look at both the structure and implementation. Under the implementation component, you'll see in my memo, it's also broken out to kind of 2 separate items. So the court will look at both the inputs and the outputs of the educational finance system. So what did the court say in Gannon 4? Again, this is a summary, quick summary. So with regard to the structure of the block grants bill, the Class Act, the court found that that act violated the structure component of the adequacy test because it does not profess to be a long-term school finance formula that is responsive to financially important changing conditions such as enrollment. The court seemed to take note that there was no provision to adjust for enrollment or for students who, such as at-risk students who needed additional supports. So the structure of the Class Act failed the constitutional test. With regard to implementation, as I said, the court looked at both the inputs and the outputs. So with inputs, the court is looking at the funding levels, the funding sources, and the funding impacts. And just some quick summary of what the court said regarding funding levels. Again, the court always stated that total spending is not the touchstone of adequacy, but that actual funding levels and the estimated costs are valid considerations in school finance decisions. The funding sources, where the money is coming from, the court stated that essentially the district court panel that was considering this should have given more consideration to all funding sources, not only state funding, such as federal funds, CAPERS, and locally raised funds, local option budget funds, for example. And then with regard to the impacts of funding, the court looked at that and noted that the evidence generally showed that the reductions in funding that were occurring led to reductions in educational programs, services, activities, staffing, and also certain classes, which impacted achievement of the Rose capacities. So that's the input side of the adequacy test. With regard to the output side, on page, right at the bottom of page 2 and over onto page 3, the court looked generally at state assessment results. And on page 3, you can see I pulled the tables that were in the Supreme Court opinion in Gannon 4 of some of the data they were looking at. Of course, they were looking at other state assessment results as well, but these were easy to pull from and kind of give a synopsis of what the court was looking at. So the court stated with regard to the outputs that the evidence showed that the state was failing to provide approximately 1/4 of all its public school K through 12 students with the basic skills of both reading and math, but it's also leaving behind significant subgroups of harder to educate students. And you can see on that first table, the first table is a rendition of the 2011 to 2012 test scores versus the 2015 to 2016 ELA and math assessment scores, and the percent scoring below proficient on those state assessments. And the court looked from, and you can see the drops that were occurring between the 2011-12 school year and the 15-16 school year, and the court took note of that. Also, the court looked at the percent college readiness measurements, again, from state assessment scores and the proficiency levels that the state board has set. And you can see the data there, and you can generally see that the drops are occurring across the grade levels from 4th grade, 8th grade to high school, across those all students and then the student subgroups. The court not only did they look at state assessments, they also looked at ACT and NAEP scores and found similar trends. In addition, the court found that graduation rates for student subgroups showed that the subgroups had higher percentages of students who were unable to graduate in 4 years compared to all students. So generally, from this implementation component and the analysis of the outputs of what the court was seeing from this data, they held that the school finance system was not reasonably calculated to meet the ROSE capacities and was unconstitutional at that time. So just quickly to bring us up to speed on it, after that Gannon 4 decision and then after Gannon 5 decision, the legislature was working and worked to bring the school finance system into constitutional compliance. So the legislature's plan to bring the school finance system into constitutional compliance after Gannon 5 was passed was to adopt what's known as the Montoy Safe Harbor Plan. In this plan, the legislature chose to determine the last time that the school finance system was constitutional, determine what inflation adjustments were needed to bring the school finance system forward from that last time it was constitutional, and bring that system forward for inflation. And a number was determined, and then the legislature chose to infuse that total inflation value into the base aid amount over a 5-year period. Again, that's known as the Montoy Safe Harbor Plan. In Gannon 6, the court generally said that that plan was sufficient and generally approved of that plan, but the court did note that some years of inflation were left off and required the legislature to add some more years of inflation to fully implement the Montoy Safe Harbor Plan that was put in front of the court. So after the Gannon Gannon 7 decision, or in Gannon 7, the court found after the legislature added those 2 extra years of inflation that the court had substantially complied with, or the legislature had substantially complied with the court's decision. So right now, all 5 years of funding have been phased in. So the school finance system is back to that level of funding that was last approved by the court as constitutional under Montoy. And moving forward, I will note there is a continual adjustment to the base aid amount going forward based on the 3-year CPIU inflation average amount. And I will note that the court did state that and recognize that this inflationary adjustment would continue to provide what they called protection for the base aid amount going forward. And to my knowledge, I know the Attorney General, I believe he submitted a petition for the court to dismiss the Gannon case this fall. I haven't received any word of the status of that. But to my knowledge, the Gannon case has not yet been dismissed, and the court still retains jurisdiction. And in the court's words, when they issued the Gannon 7 decision, they retained jurisdiction to ensure continued implementation of the scheduled funding. Madam Chair, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
All right, thank you, Nick. Okay, we're going to hold off on questions because we've got 2 more sections we want to hit. And if there are questions that we want to direct back to our reviser, we'll do so. Thank you for the thorough review. I will ask 2 questions so that when our representative comes from Kansas Department of Education, noting what the Supreme Court said, they said the state is failing to provide approximately 1/4 of all of its public school K through 12 students with the basic skills of both reading and math, and they measure that using proficiency from levels 3 and 4. So when you come up here, let us know how we're doing. Are we doing better or worse since this Gannon decision was determined in 2019? And then the second thing I want to let the committee know, I'm going to read you a quote from the Kansas Supreme Court regarding proficiency and terminology. And I think this is in Gannon 4, but I'd have to double check. So I want you to listen because this is an important comment from the Kansas Supreme Court. It says, "We acknowledge the Kansas Department of Education can sometimes change the labels for the student performance standards, the level of skills needed to meet those standards, and even the tests for measuring performance against those standards. But through it all, the underlying purpose of the standards remains constant. Here to determine educational proficiency in any given year." So basically saying that the underlying purpose of standards is to measure proficiency. Any analysis of the current state of affairs must always be judged through the lens of proficiency. And so we can change the name of proficiency, but we still want most of our kids on one side of the pendulum, not on the other side of the pendulum. So feel free to comment on any of those comments when you come forward, Ben. Next, we have a presentation on NAEP trends with state comparisons, and Matthew is stepping back into K-12 to provide that overview. And again, we'll take questions at the very end of our meeting today. Thank you, Matthew.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. This is my first presentation of the session, so if I'm a little jittery or anything, I promise it's not you, it's me. But I am glad to be here before the committee today. I will be talking about this white sheet that says summary of state assessments and then a lot of other words in a very long title. This basically contains, and I'll walk through them, but state assessment scores from 2016 through current for the state, NAEP scores for Kansas and surrounding states from 2017 through the most recent one in 22, and then ACT scores to just kind of provide a kind of multiple points of reference for some standardized testing. So starting off with state assessments, Dr. Proctor will go into much more detail, but state assessments, the purpose or all of the scoring off of it is based on a view of the student's college readiness. So there's 4 levels. The first level indicating a limited ability to utilize the skills and knowledge needed to be ready for post-secondary success. Level 2 indicating they have a basic ability, 3 an effective ability, and 4 an excellent ability. So my understanding is that it is all geared towards post-secondary success, not necessarily issues of grade level or maybe how they're currently doing. As you can see, in general, trends had been going down in the sense of more students in level 1 and 2, but then in 23, there has been kind of a bump up, as you've seen, level 1 decreasing, and level 2 kind of increasing or decreasing in some extents, and levels 3 and 4 increasing some. It is broken down by the different tests of English language arts, math and science, as well as all students, those students who qualify for free and reduced lunches, and those students who are only self-paid lunches. And then the NAEP, so in case you're not as familiar, the NAEP tests are administered across the country. They have a variety of kind of elements that are built into them of what they're looking for. The purpose of NAEP is to provide a means of kind of being able to compare state to state. Again, not necessarily something that is seeking to determine what is a grade level or what is success, but being able to kind of compare students in Colorado to students in New York, Washington to Florida, et cetera. Kansas, and I'm happy to send out some links to Susan to pass on to you that kind of show more of the data or some more interactive breakdowns. The tests are given in reading and the tests are given in math. These scores before you are kind of a combination of both of them, and it's given in grades 4 and 8. So you can see for Kansas for the last 3, because it's administered every couple of years. The Kansas scores have generally been going down a little bit, and they measure them based on a basic and a proficient, and then they do have an advanced metric. And those are just largely essentially showing that they have, basic would be that they have some evidence of understanding the concepts and procedures that NAEP is trying to measure. Proficient would be that they kind of are consistently able to integrate the knowledge and understanding of these. And then advanced would be that they can apply them with a very kind of high level and complexity and everything to them. And again, there, as you can see, kind of regionally, Kansas is typically kind of around the middle with some of our neighbors. Some are doing a little better, some are a little worse, but we have been slightly above or around the national average for the past few cycles. And then the final one I have is the ACT scores that we're all familiar with. This is, so you'll see the score by state, surrounding state, as well as the estimated % of graduates for that year that would have taken it. And again, you'll see Kansas is kind of around where the national average is, not the highest, not the lowest. And just for kind of an idea there, ACT does have kind of benchmark scores. And so these benchmark scores are an 18 in English, a 22 in math, a 22 in reading, and a 23 in science. And what those benchmarks would state is that ACT would state that a student who achieves those would have about a 50% chance of earning a B or better their freshman year in college in courses, and a 75% chance of earning a C. And so, yeah, so those are just kind of the data. And again, whenever ready, I'm happy to answer any questions I can. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Matthew. We like seeing you here in our committee. And, you know, another request I'd add on to this, this is what you provided to our interim committee, which was very, very helpful. But I didn't realize, but NAEP also provides outcomes for subgroups, correct? So you could look for at-risk students or low-income students and minority students. Perhaps we could provide a chart that has that. The K-12 Education Committee, along with the Senate Committee, had a joint meeting where they had received some testimony on that, and Kansas was really low for those low-income students and minority students. And in fact, Mississippi, Florida, the U.S. was outpacing Kansas, and I didn't realize that. I'm more familiar with our state assessments, which you can't compare to other state assessments. And so if you could provide us that as well. I think most important is just taking the time to look at this data and see how these numbers are changing over time and comparing how our students are doing with other students. So thank you very much. Committee, now we're going on to our last item because this one may take us a little bit more time, and this is the opportunity you'll have to ask questions. But Ben Proctor, come on up. In 2022, I believe it was the Kansas Legislature's desire to update how reporting is made to us and to the public. There's been a continued improvement of transparency through the updating of the website. Even when it's complicated, it's better than where it probably started, and that's great. But one of the things that we requested was the longitudinal application. We want to see that cohort of students from the 3rd to 8th grade and follow them. If you didn't know, our state assessment was first introduced as it is currently with the new standards in 2015. Now, we do have a goal, that we have submitted to the federal government that we would like to be at 75% proficiency for all students by 2030. So it may not be in our best interest to change the standards for reading and math and change the state assessment when we're so far from our goal. We're not at 2030 yet. So I would just throw that out there. But the point of the longitudinal is really trying to look at how will that group of students perform as we watch them over time. And from my understanding, this is not something that Kansas Department of Education has done previously in the recent history. Is that correct? And welcome, and you may continue.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of the committee. I appreciate you having me back 2 days in a row. It's an honor to be with you, and I look forward to our conversation today. Not to be repetitive, but I thought to start out as we talk about state assessment results, just walking back through, Matthew did a fantastic job of explaining how we describe the different performance levels. Now, many of you have background in this, but just wanted to reiterate that we're assessing standards, and how we talk about standards at the State Department and as educators, we define standards as what we want our kids to know and be able to do. And we measure that through a variety of methods. The one that's most popular, that we spend probably the most time on, is our summative assessment that we give each spring. And I'm going to walk through a lot of that data, and there's a lot of ways to break that data down. And has been described, we have different databases and reports that are available online that provide all kinds of ways to look at data at the district level and at the state level, and I can certainly walk through some of those resources as well. But just wanted to repeat a little bit that we use performance level descriptors to describe student performance for those numbers 1 through 4. And a student who performs at level 1, the term that we use to describe performance is limited, or a limited ability to demonstrate the skills and knowledge that would be reflective of a student who would be on track to be post-secondary ready. And basic would be level 2, effective would be level 3, excellent level 4. But those were descriptors that have been in place now since this particular assessment was established back in 2015. So looking at performance over time, that'd be great. Yes, thank you. Looking at performance over time, and I'll just note, you'll notice a missing year, 2020, we didn't give the state assessment. So the data that you'll see, and I think you have a hard copy of the report if we don't get it up here, but the data that you'll see is a 5-year look from 2018 through this past spring of 2023. And just for clarity purposes, this data includes all grade levels that were tested in mathematics, which would include grades 3 through 8 and 10th graders. And the blue represents level 1 performance, green represents level 2, orange represents level 3, and red represents level 4. And one of the things, we'll do some analysis of this data as we go through the slides, but you know, we look long-term, we look longitudinally at, you know, that 5-year trend, but we also look at how are we doing year over year. And one of the things that I know we talked about with the interim committee back in October, we hadn't quite received our updated data, but we were optimistic that in that year over year look, we would see at least what we would call a bottoming out effect. We had seen some declining scores over the years, and we were optimistic that we would see that trend start to reverse, and we're starting to see signs of that at this point. So we talk a lot about the urgency around movement out of level 1, and I'll show you some correlation data in a moment that gives a better indication of what level 1 performance means in terms of other very relevant measures like graduation rate, post-secondary effectiveness, ACT scores, and those types of things. But this is an overview of how our students are performing in an aggregate way in mathematics from 2018 to 2023. And again, I'll give you some highlights of that as we go through. And Madam Chair, if I need to stop for questions as we go, I'm certainly happy to do that. In English language arts, same breakdown from 2018 to 2023. This would be same grade levels that we test in math, so grades 3 through 8 and in 10th grade. And you can see some of the same types of indications from that year over year look from 2022 to 2023. But you will notice that as we go back through that 5-year period, that you would see, again, that level 1 performance has grown over time, even though recently we're starting to see indications of positive movement there, as well as on the higher end with levels 3 and 4. So we're optimistic. We always are cautious about that optimism as we think about this summative assessment, what each spring will bring, but we're optimistic that we're seeing, again, kind of a leveling off and a reversal of some of those results in both math and English language arts. Science, we don't test as much in science, so that's for grades 5, 8, and 11, but we still use the same level 1 through 4 performance categories and performance descriptors. And in that year-over-year look, we see a very consistent result, not quite the same level of improvement that we saw with math and English language arts. And again, as you look from 2018 to 2023, we've seen declining performance overall with some leveling off in the last 2 years that we've assessed. So this is an overview that we shared with the state board just to do, again, that year-to-year comparison from 2022 to 2023, and we broke it down by grade level performance in both math and English language arts. And this is where we see reason for optimism, where each grade level showed at least a declining level 1 performance or stayed fairly flat in terms of performance with level 1. And again, I'll emphasize why we feel level 1 performance and that shift and an urgent nature to do that is really important as we look at some other measures. And then we're also encouraged by the fact that we've seen an increasing number just in that year-over-year look from 22 to 23 in those levels 3 and 4. And this is just a further breakdown of that as we look at mathematic performance. So we saw no grade levels increase in level 1 of the 7 that were tested, no grade levels decrease in 3 and 4 in those performance levels. And then you can see 5 of 7 decreased in level 1 and all 7 increased in levels 3 and 4.
And I'm going to stop you there for a question because I want to make sure we're answering the question from the statute because this is our first year to follow the statute. So I want to be sure we're on the same page and we're answering the same question. So before I read the statute, can you just tell us on these charts that you provided, when you walk us back, if I were to look at this, where it says 2023 from 2018, are my third graders in 2018 now fourth graders in 2019, now fifth graders in 2021? Or are we talking about these are the scores that we saw in level 1 for each of these years for all of these students?
This would be for all students.
Okay, so, and Nick, you might have to help me because in the statute, the way that the legislative intent was, is that we have this data and it's on the website and we can do this. But what we intended, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, and I know we've got some people that are really good with stats and Nick can help clarify, but I'm gonna read it because I feel like this is different than what we've received every year, and I'm afraid that we may not be getting that today. So I want to hold on, because I don't want to just go through a report if it's not what we had intended. Okay, so let's read it. It said, provide, and this is in, so if anybody wants to look it up, it's 72-5178. It was revised, I believe, in 2022. Is that right, Nick? Okay, so it's F2. Provide a student-focused longitudinal achievement report that provides information on the academic achievement of certain student cohort groups to show the achievement gains or learning losses that are occurring for such students. Such report shall begin with the students who are entering grade 3 and grade 8 in school years 22 and 23. The report shall summarize the longitudinal achievement of such students over a 3-year period and shall be repeated every 3 years for the students entering such grades. The longitudinal report shall provide, and then it gives the specifics, the summary of the report, a review of the academic interventions the school district made, and the achievement results from the assessment. So my first question is that in this report?
Madam Chair, it's not. And so our interpretation, as the State Department reviewed that statute, our interpretation was we were looking at that data starting in 2022, 23, moving forward for a 3-year period. So that data wouldn't be available.
So you've got that's why you're only showing 1 year. You couldn't go backward. So that's interesting because in my mind, I'm thinking you could go backward and pick, you're gonna need to start to report in 22, 23. You could have taken a cohort group that was in 2019 or 2020 or 2021. You could have taken a cohort group, we have the data, and done it and provided the longitudinal assessment. It was just beginning in 22, and I see how you interpreted it, but that doesn't give us any. I mean, that means we're having to wait 3 more years. So I misinterpreted our own statute. Nick, I wanted you to comment on that. Would you be thinking that in your mind that we are looking from 2022, 23, and then 3 years progressing, and that's why you give us a 1-year snapshot, which, by the way, 1 year doesn't, it's not something that we should be hanging our hat on. It should be the extended amount of time. I was hoping we could go back, but you would have time to do it. Nick?
Madam Chair, so in subsection D2, it does say that the report shall begin with the students who are entering grade 3 and grade 8 in school year 22-23. So it's beginning at that point.
So that's a correct interpretation, so my apologies for that. But I will tell you, I'm disappointed because from the moment that I took this chairmanship 6 years ago, I've asked Del Dennis and others to provide longitudinal information based on the student records that we have, and have yet to have it. So we finally have a statute, and it's written in such a way that it really doesn't come into play. And so we are not going to know for 3 more years. So I would say it is imperative that this body not change the standards. The standards are under review this year. And if we change them, then that means we change the state assessment, we change the standards, and we'll never have this longitudinal report. We'll start over, all over again. And we need to get back to the basics for math and reading, and we're far from it. So, yeah, okay. You may proceed, but I will tell you, you do not need to comment on the items that were not requested. So the graduation rates, the post-secondary success rates, it's there for our committee to review. But I would prefer, rather than 1 year, I'd prefer for us to look, since we can't do a cohort, I'd prefer us to look at, more of a longer term trend of what's happening to our students, since we can't do a cohort in the 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade. How are 3rd graders doing over time? And I don't think you're going to be able to provide that today. So you can continue and talk about what the last assessment result was, but I don't think that will be meaningful if we can't compare it from 2015. But you can proceed.
Okay, I'm gonna do my best, and I'm happy to bring additional data back to you, just based on what you've shared here. I think maybe just defining longitudinal, and that's why we wanted to share the 2018 through 2023 data, thinking that was long-term. But maybe you can tell me what you don't want to hear, and I'll just keep moving through. Is that okay?
Just stick with the assessments, because I don't think the graduation rates or those weren't requested, or we wanted to look at the quantitative academic achievement, and the longitudinal was supposed to be on the assessment, and all you can provide us on that, because it was written in a way that begins with 22, 23, so it does us no good. We get 1 year. That's not really longitudinal. It's the beginning of a longitudinal. And 3 years from now, we have something. So it really defeats the purpose of it. I mean, interestingly enough, in hindsight, I could go back to 2022 and know what I was thinking, or we were, many of us were thinking and should have started with a certain year, but they didn't have to report it until another year. So it's my error, our error in that, because 1 year does not do a lot. Or does it? And okay, go ahead and talk about the achievement data, and then we'll open up for questions.
Okay. And I guess I'll just share, I don't know if it's helpful. We did in the statute see that there were other relevant measures like ACT and graduation, so that's why those measures are there as well. But again, just doing that 1 year comparison, you can see how we did from 22 to 23. We do feel like that's relevant because we're seeing a change. And I think that was the purpose of sharing that information, was that, we had been moving in a certain direction, and I think we're starting to see those numbers trend in a more positive way. And you can see just the way we've broken that down by different grade levels and how they did. I'll skip the graduation part. Is that what you're asking me to do? Okay. And post-secondary as well. The ACT results, is that one that I should also skip?
You're welcome to continue on that.
Okay. So one of the points that might be relevant would be in the class of 2020, that's when, that was the first group that the ACT was offered for free during that junior year, or for students that had not taken it their senior year. So the first group that would have been drastically impacted by that change would have been that class of 2020. One of the things that we see in the ACT results is a decline and a leveling off in those last 2 years of this report, which was a little bit unique. As we saw almost every other state continue to decline, we remain flat in those graduating classes of 21 and 22. This is, I think, important data that we've been talking to a lot of school systems about, and Madam Chair, I'll rely on you to tell me if you feel like this would be a good point of reference, but it's what we call our correlation data, and it takes the state assessment results, and this would be for high school students. This would be for our 10th graders that take the state assessment in both math and English language arts. And what it does, it gives you the correlations for students who perform at the different performance levels. And what we've done is we've taken the 4 performance levels and divided those in half. So a student who scores in level 1, there's a wide range of level 1 and level 2 and level 3, level 4 performance. So we've cut those in half at the midpoint of where those cut scores represent a particular level. And we've looked at how do students who perform at the top and bottom of a particular performance level, how do they do in terms of graduation? How do they do in terms of post-secondary effectiveness? And what is their average ACT score? And this has provided, I think, a little bit broader perspective for our educators who want to know more about what does it mean when a student performs a certain way on one measure like a springtime state assessment. So what you can see in this data, not surprisingly, is that the lower students perform on the state assessment, the less likely they are to graduate. So if you perform at the bottom of level 1, just as an example, only 72% of those students go on and graduate. Only about 16 or 17% of those students meet any kind of post-secondary effective rate metric, and they average about a 13.5 on the ACT. As you move into an upper level 1, you see that graduation rate start to go up into the 80s. You see 32%, about a third of those students who achieve some kind of post-secondary effective metric and an ACT score of around 15. Once you get into level 2 performance, you start to see graduation rate increase quite a bit. And that goes back to that kind of basic understanding of the standards. So you move from a real limited student who has significant limitations academically reflected in level 1 to a student who's starting to grow in academic knowledge related to those standards, and so you start to see those numbers improve. You see about half of the students who perform in low level 2 meet some kind of post-secondary criteria, and then you're up to a 17 or 18 on an ACT, which would be more of an entry point score a high level two, and we talked a little bit about the term proficiency earlier. This is where we talk a lot about this with our educators, because we have a lot of students who perform in that level two range that we see as successful. And I think some of these numbers reflect that. And that's where we struggle a little bit with terminology. When we say a student may not be considered proficient, but may score a 21 or close to a 22 on an ACT and go on and do, very, very good things in the post-secondary opportunities that are made available to them. So you have, those students graduating at a very high rate. You have a lot of them meeting post-secondary criteria, and you see academic success that falls below that line that we've established that we often refer to as proficiency. And then, of course, once you get into the low level three and upper level three, you see those numbers continue to increase as students are demonstrating more knowledge of standards and more understanding of what they need to be able to do to be ready in post-secondary. So this has been, I think, very impactful data as we talk about state assessments being one particular measure that we know is important as we relate it to standards. So be happy to answer any questions on the data.
Committee, I know I have
Sure, I'd
some.
also love to talk about what we want to do about addressing academic performance as well if we have time.
That would be great. I know I have a lot of questions, but you first. Committee? Yes. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for presentation. I have a number of things that I'm confused about. And I think the first thing that you mentioned is definition of longitudinal. Perhaps I have a different definition than you do. My definition of longitudinal is how does a student perform over a period of time. In other words, the longer the exposure to the academic system, what is the effect on the student? Is there any indication that we're looking at the same students over time in this data?
So I'll just go back to our overtime look here. So these would be, this particular data that we provided is just a grade level breakdown.
It is a composite data of all students. Is that the way I'm seeing it?
That would be, yes. That's
okay. Then explain to me, I think this is page 8. And we have these ELA academic performance. And this is 2023 compared to 2022. Is that what I'm reading correctly here?
That's correct.
So we're doing a one-year comparison between what?
Between how students performed in the summative assessment on 2022, on the 2022 test and the 23 test, and whether or not we saw gains or decreases between those two spring tests.
Okay, what's this column that says grade level then?
It's broken down by grade level. So in third grade, and we're looking at just third grade students in 22 and third grade students in 2023, and how third grade students in 22 did versus third grade students in 2023.
Okay, so this is not using the state assessments?
This is using the state assessment.
Okay, I'm totally confused because it's my understanding that state assessments are given to 3 specific grade levels.
Oh, they're given to grades 3 through 8 and 10.
Why does it say 3, 5, and 8, or 3?
The science test is given to 3 grade levels. The math and English language arts is given to grades 3 through 8 and 10.
Okay, so the English arts, that's what this is the ELA here.
I'm sorry, ELA would stand for English language arts.
Okay, so you have a continuous data stream, and so you could actually do longitudinal study
Yes.
on ELA.
Yes, and we would be happy, and I do apologize, Madam Chair, for the confusion and misinterpretation on our end, but we would be happy to bring back additional data on that. So, but yes, for clarification, those grade levels would be the grade levels that were tested in English language arts both of those years and every year since we've given this assessment.
Okay. And so we don't really have any comparison between any of the other subjects. It's only ELA that we have a comparison there.
ELA and math,
But math, you do,
same grades. So grades 3 through 8. Math and English language arts are very comparable in terms of how we test and the grade levels that we test.
thank you. That's helping me to understand.
Okay.
I think if we get on the same idea of what longitudinal means, we could get some meaningful data out of that, because I'm more concerned, and I don't know how other committee members are, but I'm more concerned about whether children make progress over time than what it looks like at this point in time. And then I have my last question. She gave me 3. I don't know, am I at 3? This chart here, this correlation data, 10th graders, the statistician in me is just screaming at this chart, because we have continuous variables, right? So we have a score that ranges from 0 to 100 or whatever. We have a continuous variable, and we have chopped that up into categorical variable, which reduces the power of statistics. Continuous variable is a much more powerful statistical tool. And putting this in the form of regression lines would give us way more information. To me, what's been done here of chopping this up, and instead of going to 4, now we have 8, is that if we chop data up enough and present it enough ways, we can make it say what we want it to. And I am much more in preference of you provide us with the data, we look at it and see whether there's statistical differences in what's going on. And that's just that's a comment, that's not really a question, but you can comment on it if you want to.
No, I appreciate that, and we talk about that in our research and evaluation meetings. And I think the reason we show it is because we've been showing it a lot over the past year. And one of the things that we find value in the conversation sometimes, we look at, again, kind of how we're positioning ourselves to help students move from one level to the next. So sometimes, we see students improve when we look at that more longitudinal look and we look at individual students, and we can see students grow, but they don't move into another performance category. So we don't often see students move from level 1 to level 2, but we see movement within level 1. So this is a way to talk about the data, break it down a little bit further in more detail, and I agree with you, there's restrictions to the usefulness of this, but it allows us to talk to educators about growth, even when that growth doesn't show up in the reports that we typically provide. So it's more of a way that we can talk about the data that makes it very relevant, or as relevant as possible, to our educators as they're trying to improve student outcomes.
Thank you.
We do understand the limitations.
I know exactly what you're saying.
Okay, and I'm going to follow up really quick, because on this idea of longitudinal, and that, even for these 2 years, we didn't get that, and you pulled that out specifically, that we could have had that, and that schools should be doing that. They should be looking at their 3rd graders and finding how are they performing when they're in the 4th grade, and how is that same group of students performing when they're in the 5th grade, and we're not doing that. Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't.
Yeah, go ahead.
I will say there's actually, this afternoon, just as an example, we do look at that data, and I do, again, apologize, it's not provided today. I'd be happy to bring it back. But just today, we introduced a resource for system leaders that are gathered in Topeka to look at that very thing. Our research and evaluation team has produced what we call a transition table. And I would be happy to demonstrate that for you, because we feel like it can be a useful tool that would show how students are performing from, how individual students are performing from one year to the next. So we do see a lot of relevance in that data point, and we do have resources that would provide not only internal ability to analyze that data over time, but trying to equip our school systems with the same capabilities in the easiest way possible. So that would be an internal resource for school systems to have available to them because it's identifying particular students, but it would show over a period of time how students are doing from one year to the next in both an aggregate, so how many students are performing at a particular level, and then what does that look like the following year? So there are resources that we're providing to have a better look longitudinally to our school systems, and we would have that data available.
And I would just also note that in statute for at-risk funding, schools are supposed to be providing how their students are improving and what kind of interventions they're doing. And I think from remembering from last year, there's nothing that happens with those reports. They're just reports. Is that correct?
We receive those reports.
What do you do with them?
Well, we're right now what we're doing is analyzing everything we do around at-risk. So what we've done is gone through everything that the state board is responsible for. We provide a list of evidence-based practices that, based on the LPA audit, told us that there's weakness in that list, that there's things on that list that they couldn't find evidence for, and we agreed. And took responsibility for that and evaluated every single item on that list this fall. And we'll be providing recommendations to our state board on adjustments that need to be made so that we can provide a thorough evidence-based list to our school systems and that they can use their at-risk funds appropriately based on evidence that the programs and practices on that list help at-risk students. So we're using those reports right now to better understand what school systems are spending their at-risk dollars on, and then we want to develop supports to provide them with the guidance that they need if adjustments need to be made based on where we were inadequate in the past of not having a list that really reflected current evidence based on what works for at-risk students. So that's one of the things we use that report for.
And I would just add to that the legislature will also, at least in this committee, be taking a look at the statutes related to at-risk reporting, at-risk funding as well. And I want to read something to the committee, and we're going to then take a few more questions and then wrap up here. And then you can provide back maybe a little bit more longitudinal report back to the committee, and we will pass that out. This was actually provided in testimony, again, not in my committee, but in the Education Committee and the Senate Education Committee, and it says that 88% of students who failed to earn a diploma, they were struggling readers in the third grade. It said 4 times students who are not reading proficiently in third grade are 4 times more likely to not graduate from high school. They are 6 times as not likely to graduate from high school if they are African American or Hispanic, and they're 8 times more likely not to graduate if they are not proficient readers by third grade if they are both low-income minority. So it's 8 times. So why is that relevant to our conversation today? The longitudinal aspect. If a student can't read at third grade, they're still not reading better at fourth grade, they're not reading better at fifth grade, and then it compounds, and then they can't do anything. They're frustrated, they're behavioral issues, they're not able to even have any soft skills because they don't feel like they have a reason to be at school. And furthermore, just to kind of going to the ks.gov website for free lunch students, ELA, for all students, which is the nicest way to show it. If I break it down in grades, it looks a lot worse. We've got just for level 1, which would be below grade level. And by the way, that the language has been changed every 5 years for every category. It's changed, but it's still proficiency for the top 2 levels for the federal government. But it's 46%. The improvement from last year, it went from 47.57 to 45.9. If I trade and I look at another subgroup, I'm just going to do one because I think everybody in here should take a moment at some time and look at this. If I just click on African American, English language arts. In 2022, 55.86% of our African-American students were in the lowest category. It only jumped up by 1%. And I don't think that's good enough. And I'm really concerned. I mean, we talk about this year after year after year, but it's about the students that we're leaving behind. And the Kansas Supreme Court said we were failing 25%. Now it's way higher than that. In these groups of low-income students, the free and reduced lunch, we're talking about, we're not leaving behind 20%. 80% are being left behind. And I guess I just wish that the report would give us a better understanding of where we are.
And again, we'd be happy to share the data that you're requesting. I would agree with everything that you said, Madam Chair. I don't know if now's the time, but we would love to talk to you about what we're doing with the State Board and through the State Department. I would say the data on everything that you described in terms of the research on third grade reading proficiency is accurate and unacceptable as far as we would be concerned. And that's why we are building into our accreditation model structured literacy. We believe that the school improvement and accreditation model that the State Board approved in December is a great first step to say that no longer is a lack of training, a lack of resources, a lack of professional development around literacy acceptable. And we believe that we can raise accountability for school systems to ensure that we have implementation of structured literacy moving forward with this school improvement and accreditation model. And would love to share more on that. You know, the data is important, there's no question. And we have lots of data. We can provide the data however you want it. I made a mistake today not providing the right data, and I apologize for that. I think the most important thing we can do is talk about how we work together to improve what I would describe as adult behaviors in school. I believe that our educators are fantastic in Kansas. And I believe that just talking to students recently, they believe that too. But I believe we've been focused on a lot of things for a long time. And I think you'll hear, if you were a part of the joint committee last week when Dr. Lori Curtis shared on structured literacy, she talked about this idea of fundamentals, 4 fundamentals, and we referred to those back in October during the interim committee as well. And we're building an accreditation model on that elevates quality instructional practice, and it elevates things like the alignment of curriculum. So if you think about how we measure students against standards, we're using a state assessment that happens each spring. It's a relevant data point. We don't want to deny that that's important because it's measuring the things that we want our kids to know and be able to do. However, have you ever talked to a 10th grader about that assessment? I mean, the reality is they will tell you they don't see the value in that. So we're relying on a measure that our students will say generally is not a good indicator of what I know and can do. It is a measure that needs to remain very relevant, but what we're building is a model where we're identifying leading indicators, so the things that we can influence directly, the behaviors that our professionals can exhibit within systems that will be much more relevant, and I think exactly what we need to do to improve these outcomes and truly lead the world in the success of each student. So I'd love to spend time with you on that model because I think that is the key for us. I think it's something that we can all agree to, that it's around structured literacy. It's about aligning what we do in our classrooms to the standards that we've established. We would completely agree. We do not need to change the standards. We've got some of the highest standards in the nation, but we need to align to them, and we need to equip our educators with the resources that they need, because I do believe they're doing the very best they can. We're working on that as a team at KSDE right now. The board has given us the authority through their approval in December to do that work. We need to have a more balanced assessment model, meaning the most important metric I think that we can find and the investment we need to make is not just this summative end-of-year test, but a through-year assessment that's going to allow our teachers to have standards reference data through the year to inform what they're doing with those kids while they have them. Because what they get with that summative report, those students have already moved on to the next grade level. So we're investing right now in what we call a pilot around a common assessment model. We've got an interim assessment model, and we want to make that data most useful. So these are the things that we're really elevating, and it's all around quality instruction, supporting educators in the classroom. And would, again, love to share more about that model and the things that we're doing, because everything you said around third grade literacy was exactly right.
All right, we'll take a few more questions, and I will say that the principals were offered, or superintendents were offered several years ago. We were told that they could switch out ACT rather than having the 10th grade assessment, and there was some kind of vote, and they chose to stay with the 10th grade assessment. So those options are still there, and so that would be something that KSD could follow up on. Other questions? Representative Johnson.
So we've looked, thank you, Madam Chair. A recent article in the Topeka Capital quotes the governor as making the statement that these results are vast improvements, and I'm quoting from the Topeka Capital. Do you agree with that statement?
I may go back to the definition of terms. I think that when you look at something like declining academic performance that year after year after year is going down, then I would say the reversal of that, the word vast, I don't know if I would use that word, but I think it's significant, you know, that we've seen that bottoming out and then a reversal. So I can see why she would say that and use that terminology for sure. But I will say there's such a long ways to go. So to say that we're satisfied with just a correction of a declining trend is absolutely not the case. So I hope that answers your question. I'm not going to disagree with the governor.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Madam.
You will not vastly disagree. All right, other questions? All right, well, thank you for providing a report. We look forward to an amended report on this. We look forward to maintaining our standards, improving our standards, and then ultimately hitting that mark that was offered in 2017, Every Child Succeeds Act, that said Kansas will ensure that 75% of all of their students will be proficient in math and reading. So I would love to see that day. That goal is 2030, ladies and gentlemen, 2030. And right now, proficiency is probably hovering around some 30-some% for all students. So we've got a little work to do. We are adjourned, and have a good evening.